Awesome. So tonight I am interviewing Moriah, who is a student at Fuller, who is getting her PsyD in psychology. I mean, clearly that's what a PsyD is a doctorate in psychology. And can you tell us a little bit, Moriah, about the population you serve, or like where you want to concentrate your practice on after you graduate?
Yeah, so I am a fourth year PsyD student, so I'm working on my Doctor of Psychology in Clinical Psychology. I graduated with my master's a couple years ago. So right now, as a student, I work at different practicum sites. So this year, I'm at a UCC, or a University Counseling Center, so working with a pretty wide diversity of people. But in my career, I really want to specialize with working with the queer community. And a big part of that is also identifying as bisexual. And I think that lived experience and our own voices are really powerful when working with clients. And that has been a big part of why I'm passionate about the work that I do, but also something that's felt really meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like working with the queer community and wanting to specialize with the queer community, what do you feel like having lived experience has brought to your clients? Like as a clinician, how do you feel like that affects your therapeutic relationship?
Yeah. So, one, I think wanting to specialize in working with the LGBTQIA community is really important because, you know, the more I've become interested in this, the more I've realized the lack of training that most people in the behavioral health field, so whether that's like MFTs, psychologists,
Totally.
social workers, like everyone in the field.
Abbreviation. Yeah. The whole abbreviation gamut.
Everyone who's working with people in this general capacity, there's a severe lack of training on working with this community. And I'm actually writing my dissertation. It's going to be a curriculum to conduct a training with mental health trainees on working with the LGBTQIA community. So part of, the research that I've done in prep for the whole dissertation process, training on working with this community is inconsistent at best, is what research really shows, is that if sometimes students will get training at sites, sometimes they might get some training in classes, but it tends to be really inconsistent. And depending on what type of program you're in, depends on the length. So like my program is 5 years, so I'll have 4 different placements before I graduate with, like built into my program. But a lot of master's programs are only 2 or 3 years. So people in a program like that only have, 1 or 2, potentially 2 placements before they graduate. And then of course there's the whole licensure process that goes on, and there's lots of training involved. But a lot of clinicians tend to have to seek out training on their own, whether that's reading things or doing a continuing education unit in that, like a workshop type thing, or getting a certification. So there's a pretty big need for this service. And I think something that I'm also passionate about, and my research lab that I'm part of at school, with my faculty advisor, we study the intersection of spirituality and sexuality. So we've gotten to do some different projects on how those things intersect. And even, I've worked at different sites, haven't, it's different than being in private practice and attracting the clients that are your niche. But I've worked with a lot of clients who are queer, and quite a few who have also come from religious backgrounds. And there aren't a lot of people who have training on working with that niche. I think something that's really cool about the internet is being able to meet other clinicians online who do that too. That's how we became friends.
Totally.
But that's something that I think my clients have felt really seen when I've been able to say, yeah, I know what that's like, or yeah, I know what your experience is. And being able to talk about those intersections because it is something that can feel really isolating if you grow up identifying within the LGBTQIA community I can speak to growing up in an evangelical background, and what that's like.
For sure. And how, especially if you've grown up in like an evangelical background, how it affects like the way you see yourself, the way you understand your body, the way you understand like your place in the world, how you move throughout the world. It informs a lot. So I can imagine having clients that know that you actually understand through lived experience what's happened and what they're experiencing brings like a certain amount. I would imagine it would bring like a certain amount of rapport with it. And also like this built-in just like trust of like, oh, okay, this isn't something that like she has like read about. Cause like you're saying, like going out and finding trainings for specific LGBTQIA plus communities and with groups, you have to go and find the literature yourself. You have to go and find, like I'm in a Facebook group with affirming therapists, and it's a mix of people who identify and who are allies. And there is so much of like this background, like beat of like learn from clinicians who are trans, learn from clinicians who are queer, like pay them for their work, take their trainings, do the work so that you can understand what this is. Because if you're not, it's very clear, especially within that group, the rules are you are not practicing within your scope of practice, and you could do so much harm if you are treating these clients and this community and not educating yourself within this background.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Personal story. So when I started, I was out to myself and trying to decide how to come out. Because again, I like grew up in an evangelical sense. I go to a seminary. I, went to a religious school for undergrad, have always kind of existed in these circles, and, went back to therapy when I moved out here for, my own mental health, but because I also knew that coming out and my identity was something that I wanted to process and to decide what that meant for me. Because I think, especially identifying as bi, when I first came out to myself, I was like, oh, well, I could never come out. Like nobody would ever need to know if I just dated a man or was with a man or married a man.
If I was straight passing. Right.
Like I could just keep this to myself for the rest of my life. So wanting to really kind of process what that would be like for me and what I wanted to do. So when I was looking for a therapist, I, didn't know a ton about what I was looking for, but a lot of, like if you look at a therapist webpage, they'll kind of list either like specialties or populations that they work with. And so this therapist, said that they, work with, the LGBTQ community. So I was like, okay, cool. When I'm ready to talk about this, like we can talk about this. So I started, we started talking about it, things would be fine, but she definitely like seemed more comfortable when I was talking about like my mental health stuff. And then, I was slowly coming out to friends to kind of build some supports before I would, decide if I wanted to publicly come out or do something larger. And I'd had a conversation with a friend that I thought went well. A couple months went by, and then I had a conversation with this friend, and they were just like, I don't think I'm as affirming as I've been coming across, and kind of just like stepped back and then moved on to a different subject. Like there wasn't really a conversation. It was just kind of like they dropped this, changed subject, and then proceeded to like avoid me for 2 months. So it was just kind of this thing that I was like trying to process through basically by myself, because I was like, I don't even know what this means or what this would mean for friendship. Like, do I want to repair this? Like, is this something that like, we could find common ground? Like, what does this mean? And so obviously I was like trying to talk about this in therapy because I was only out to like one other person. That's the appropriate place to do it. Right. That's the safe, appropriate place to do it. Yeah. Yeah. And so I, was trying to like have this conversation with my therapist, and I was like, I don't know what that means. Like, if we have this different perspective, she says she's not affirming, but that's like not only my identity, that's my career, that's my research. Like what I want to specialize, like that kind of covers most areas of my life. Like what would I talk about with this person? Like what would we connect over for someone that was a really close friend? And so it would be this just like huge shift, if that's what it meant. And this therapist asked me if my friends had to have the same opinions as I did.
Okay, this is so interesting because, and this might, I don't know, John and I are always like, this might open a can of worms for another podcast, but I'm here for it. So here is something that has been very interesting for the last few years, because I started collecting my clinical hours in 2019. So as the world has completely changed, right, in the span of 2 years, when your therapist said that to you, what did you hear her say?
It felt very invalidating because like my identity, who I am as a person, my career, like all of these things that are really important to me are not an opinion. It's not like, do you like grilled cheese? Like, do you like winter or summer?
On principle, I don't eat tomatoes, right? Like this is not a matter of opinion or choice, which reveals so much about that therapist as well. Right? In that moment had to have been in a moment where you're trying to process something that was very upsetting and had long lasting implications for you, to hear her say that, then like, as I'm hearing you say it, sounds like re-traumatizing or like a trauma on top of a trauma, right? Where it's like, this is the kind of thing that like we would like to avoid as clinicians who serve the queer population, and why like we seek to like be well informed is to avoid literally like that situation. Yeah.
And then, so I'm very much an internal processor. So it like hit me a little bit, but then like in the week between, therapy sessions, I was like, oh, that was really bad. That did not feel good. And there had been some other, just instances where there had been misses, and I'd like tried to bring them up and we just hadn't like been able to resolve them great, but I was like, this is fine. So we like, I go back and I'm like, this really sucked, and she was just like, oh yeah, like, that's what you heard. Like, it just, she was very like psychodynamic too. So like, was a lot of like, no disclosure, no reaction. And like, at the time was learning that was not okay for me, because I just don't feel very contained when there's no response. But just kind of this like back and forth. And so I was, and didn't really apologize. And so then I just was kind of like, I've been thinking about what it would be like to see a therapist who's queer. And she was like, well, Moriah, I haven't told you whether or not I'm queer.
You were like, I will pay you double my session fee right now if you're queer.
Yeah, I was like, okay, maybe you're queer, but if you are, you have not integrated that part into yourself. Like,
that is a compartmentalized, completely separate. If you had an integrated
queer identity, you would not consider that to be an opinion.
Okay, and this also is so interesting to me because I love that phrase. When I heard you, when you posted about it the other day, that integrated queer personality, right? Like, and I love that somebody asked you, like, what does that even mean? And it's like, it's so obvious to people who are queer what about them has to be integrated, especially within religious communities, because it's been so, like, that part of you has been so othered in every aspect of your life, right? And so it's very, I mean, I kind of love that she squirmed a little bit, that the therapist squirmed a little bit, because I've had conversations with other clinicians and with people who work within the church and who are seeking therapy of, is it important to you to know where your therapist stands politically? And I'm very open with my clients about where I stand politically, because the political issues that come up in session are, for me, tied to human dignity and human worth, and whether or not I see you as a person or whether or not I see you as someone with a lifestyle choice that needs to like repent of that situation, right? Like that, that directly, it cannot be, in my opinion, extricated from how I'm seeing you as a person, even though that's what we're taught, right? In undergrad and grad school is like, oh, like unconditional. Well, I mean, not everybody's taught unconditional positive regard, but you're taught like you have to come in without any biases. And that, to me, that's impossible. If you don't think that Black lives matter, this is a problem. If you don't think that queer lives matter, this is also a problem. If you don't think that trans people are people, this is also a problem, right? Like,
because it affects our marginalized clients. It's not as important for people who are in the majority, but for people who are marginalized, especially those that have multiple marginalized identities, that isn't just an opinion. That's validating their humanity, validating these parts of themselves that have been marginalized intentionally through power structures and...
That's a really good point, because like when you mention that too, like multiple marginalized identities, then it becomes a matter of safety as well for that client, right?
Yeah.
Like knowing not only like, are they emotionally safe, but like, are they physically safe? Are they, you know, are they okay to come in as they are, and they have a right to feel safe when they're sitting across from you? Or, you know, when they're doing telehealth and they're sitting across the screen from you, they deserve a right to be comfortable. That's really interesting. I love the way that you put that.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
I think, and two, I, you know, was like about halfway through my first therapy practicum when the pandemic hit, and then just like everything that we walked clients through that year, like, you know, I've always been very like social justice minded, and I strongly believe that therapy is political. But yeah, just walking through, you know, the George Floyd shooting and the pandemic and the riots, and because I live in LA, so yeah, the curfew, things were shut down. Like, but just all of these different events that, you know, we all lived through 2020. Like, there were so many things
that were highly impactful,
especially working with marginalized clients who are bringing these things into session and talking about like, do I feel safe driving in Orange County as someone who's not white? Like, can I stop and get gas when I drive
when
through,
I need
you know, like just things like that, I butt heads, especially with one professor a lot who is very psychoanalytic. And, you know, when I turn things in and I'm like, yes, therapy is political. Therapy is always political. Existing is political. And they're like, but does it always need to be? I'm like, yeah.
Because people are fluid and dynamic, and they have to be. God bless it. I feel like so because my background is in social work, like my bachelor's degree and my master's degree, it was much more of like a macro. And I asked like in my graduate placement for a macro placement. So I did like a lot of nonprofit work, but just in general, like we learn like CBT, we learn psychodynamic, we learn person and environment systems. But we don't focus like on one specific or multiple specific, even like treatment modalities. So I literally like had to Google like 3 weeks ago, like somebody was a psychoanalyst, and I'm like, what is a psychoanalyst? So then I like looked it up and I was like,
Think Freud.
Oh, I've got opinions. Like, I've got big opinions about this. So let's talk about it. But too, like, I would be interested to hear too, how as a client and as a clinician, talk to me about what it's like to have like less of a psychodynamic version. Cause that's truly with individual work. That's what we learned is like, you are a blank slate in social work. You come in as a blank slate. You let that client be, you do not like self-disclosure, especially for bachelor's level. No, do not self-disclose at any time. And when I went into individual work, it was very difficult I had to talk with my supervisors multiple times about being like, I go through all the things of like, why am I bringing this up? How is this going to benefit the client? What am I trying to accomplish? But I couldn't imagine not disclosing certain things to clients on principle. So like, what does that look like for you as a clinician and as a client? First, what are your needs for self-disclosure? How do you guide that process, especially with a marginalized community?
Yeah. So what you're describing is more like psychoanalytic, which if you think back to like the foundations of psychology, that's what Freud and his colleagues practiced was analysis, and that's very much blank slate. The analyst doesn't bring anything in, and the work is, so it's also called like one person psychology. So the patient, they typically say patient. The patient is coming in and they are projecting onto the analyst. So whatever is happening in the room is all coming from the patient. And, you know, that's where like free association is, or just like, you know, kind of talking. And that's still something that happens today. It's a very specialized field. So basically you have to go to an analytic institute on top of your training. So you basically get a second doctorate, like after you go through like a PsyD or PhD program, to be trained to be an analyst. So it's very specialized. There's a lot of nuances and things. So from like psychoanalysis has come down, and there's more like psychodynamic theories. So I typically operate from a relational psychodynamic perspective. And relational psychodynamic theory believes in a two-person psychology. So the therapist is bringing themselves into the room, and they're showing up as an authentic person, and the client is also showing up, and the work that we do is together based on what we are both bringing into the session. I'm not pretending that I am a blank slate, and I'm being myself, again, appropriately, like thinking about, like, will this benefit the client? Is this something that's appropriate? Like keeping it in mind. It's different than being friends or, you know, anything else.
Totally.
But the work that we're doing is together. And that's why, you know, I think it's really important that therapy is political, and that if I'm showing up as my authentic self, I'm wanting to learn and I'm wanting to validate. And again, like thinking about like, these are issues of like validating humanity. These are issues of safety, and thinking about these different perspectives. And what you mentioned earlier, I talked a little bit about, but about, you know, an integrated self and an integrated identity. This is not something I've come up with. I can't think of the person's name at the moment. But this is a concept in psychology that you have all of these different pieces of yourself, or these different identity domains. And a lot of people, especially those with multiple marginalized identities, have learned to compartmentalize those identities for safety, for survival. So relational work can be really helpful in starting to, you know, I like to think of it as like all of these different things are like in boxes in the closet, and because, you know, queer work. But
because it's just the perfect analogy. Sure.
It's just in the closet, you know. But then in therapy, you know, you can start to pull out a box and be like, you know, I went through some racial trauma, and this really impacted me, and I wasn't able to connect with, you know, my parents' nationality and ethnicity and history. I wasn't able to connect with that culture because I was bullied by this group. And I, you know, to talk about those different things. And, you know, so one thing might be a, you know, prevalent theme for a while, and then they might bring out another box, and then they might talk about, well, you know, I've experienced homophobia in, you know, my racial group, but I've also experienced racism in the queer community. And so I feel like I can't show up as my whole self necessarily in either place.
In any domain, yeah.
And so it's things like that that you start to think through, or like specifically with religious trauma. Like I grew up evangelical. I grew up, you know, really Christian. We don't affirm queer people. Like that's a sin. You can't be that. So then like, can you go be a Christian at church, but a queer person outside? And a lot of queer people have experienced, you know, religious trauma or abuse from the religious communities, and so sometimes there can be hesitation or skepticism about religion
for sure,
the LGBTQ community, because people have experienced a lot of hurt. So with things like that, relational work can provide a space to process through some of those things. And so again, like going back to the like own voices things, like that's something that's really important to me because, you know, I grew up really evangelical. I you know, I've thought back about this the past few years. Like, I didn't know that queer women existed until I was like 14 years old. I knew that gay men like existed, like somewhere in a distant, like, because that was bad.
Sure.
But it wasn't until I was in high school and I had friends who like identified as bisexual and were like, yeah, I'm queer. And I was like, oh, I don't know what that is. Like,
yeah, could you define that for me? Yeah.
And then, you know, like that still being like something that was really, you know, really had a lid on it. And I, you know, didn't know what sexual attraction to women looked like or romantic attraction because it wasn't something that we really talked about. And like for me, both from, you know, church and the world, sexual attraction looked like objectification of women.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, like lusting at, you have to dress wrong, so you have to do all these
powerful
things. And so I was like, oh, I don't do that. I don't feel like that towards women. I'm not queer. Like I'm, because I don't think of that. So
right. Like if this is the definition, then I don't meet that criteria. Yeah. That's so
even having those different experiences of like, being like, oh, I basically dated that person for 3 years. The stereotypical queer woman relationship.
Sure.
But those things that like,
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, you think you're the only one.
Yes.
Because it was so isolating to experience those things and you didn't know what was happening at the time. So then I'm looking back and trying to understand my experiences. I'm like, oh, now they make sense to me, or now I understand.
Totally.
That. But at the time, I didn't know what was happening. And
yeah,
now
especially when you're not allowed to talk about it.
Situations.
Especially when you're living in a culture where it's like, no, we don't talk about sexuality, let alone like queer sexuality. Like we completely shut down any other attraction apart from a hetero relationship. It's like so off limits. You don't even get the chance to like talk about it or broach it with anybody else. So you like, I can imagine like how isolating that is for people who and like would be one explanation, right? For the later in life, like epiphany of, oh, like, no, that is me. That is so, yeah, that's so, so true. Because when you're so far removed from that and like, there's this culture of like almost secrecy or like definitely a culture of like shame around that. It's protected so well within that community that it's not ever broached by anybody in it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's something that can be really powerful about being like, yeah, I grew up in this. I know what this is like to be like, oh, that's what that was. And to be able to, you know, share pieces of that in, you know, small settings in ways that's appropriate with clients. Like I just started a LGBTQIA hope and coping group at my site. And it's a curriculum that someone wrote, I found on the internet. It was like their dissertation. But we were, you know, kind of doing intros and just talking about, you know, someone had asked another person about like, why do you identify with this label? So they were just kind of having some conversations. And one of them was like, yeah, I grew up in the evangelical church. I didn't really know that there were like gay girls until I was a teenager. And so I like let them finish their story. And I was like, I didn't either. And, and that was something that was appropriate that I could share and be like, yeah, you're not the only one.
Same. You were not alone.
Gone through this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that can be really powerful for clients. And I see a therapist who has a very similar theoretical orientation to me. He's very like relationally driven. And so even like thinking about like, oh, and she identifies openly as queer. And so just thinking about like, oh, these are the things that feel really powerful when I sit with my therapist, when I'm going through difficult things. And, you know, I'll make jokes sometimes about like, you know, when Happiest Season came out, I like watched it with a couple friends like the first day. And then a couple days later, like went to therapy and I was like, have you seen Happiest Season? And she was like, yes. And I was like,
she's like, obviously.
This is affirmative therapy. Like you can come and talk about queer culture and you know that like.
Right? Like, I feel like to be well-versed. I don't know. I feel like there's also like, I mean, we could talk for hours about this, but I feel like there's also like a crossover with like the queer community and the neurodivergent community and like the very specific niche interests within both of those cultures, right? I also I take great pride when my clients bring up a TV show or a movie or a video game. I have already experienced, like if it's released on a Thursday and they see me on a Tuesday, I'm already familiar with like what they're bringing in order to be able to speak intelligently toward their experience and what they're going through, because I know they love video games, or I know that they love, you know, they were really looking forward to the release of this book or whatever. Like there's something very humanizing and very comforting about, because I saw my therapist literally at 6. And so that's my relationship with my therapist as well, right? Where I don't have to explain to her, like I used a TikTok sound as an analogy and she like knew what TikTok sound I was talking, you know what I mean? Like it's like very nice to have that common language. And so I can imagine your clients feel the same way with you, and you feel the same way with your therapist, it sounds like, as well.
Yeah. I think it can be really humanizing. And to me, that's why I love relational work, because what happens in the therapy room is a learning experience. It's a teaching experience. And we talk a lot about, like, there's this concept of like corrective emotional experiences, that if you haven't experienced, like if you didn't get something that you need, if you didn't get affirmation from a parent or something, and that's something that like you can experience appropriately in therapy, like that can be really corrective. And so I think that's something that can be really powerful, to be seen and validated, and like, yes, your interests are important to me. Yes, I know it's happening. But any type of relational work that happens can be reflective of the outside world as well. If you learn to be safe in an environment, you learn what it's like to be in a relationship with someone who cares about you and your interests. And then like you can try and model that in your own relationships or outside of therapy. And that's one of the reasons that I love relational work, is because, you know, our lives are relational. There's so many things. And you can learn those skills, and you can, you know, learn what that's like in therapy, so that you can have that in other areas of your life.
Absolutely. That it's directly like related to, it's not therapy isn't something that you go to for an hour every week to have skills that are not directly related to your lived experience, right? And something that you can like take out from that. I love that. This has been a very enlightening experience for me, because there are at least 3, like relational therapy. What did you say? Corrective emotional experience. Yeah. Those are 2 things that I like did not have words for. So I love that. I just kept calling it rapport. So I have toyed with the idea of getting my PsyD like every once in a while, and I'm 35, so I feel like I'm too far gone to do it. But if I got a doctorate,
at any age, but it's and I think that's one of like, because obviously like there's so many reasons to pick each specific degree, each specific licensure, but like there are some times when I'm like, yeah, we do have a little bit of a leg up, because we have a lot more time to like study like 3 different big overarching like theories, and like we have like 4 different practicums to like work with different populations or do different things that I'm like.
And to be clear, all of that work is grueling. Like it is grueling. The experience you've described is grueling. Yeah,
but sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm really glad that I didn't just get one and then like thrust out into the world to be like, go figure it out.
and that's kind of like, I mean, to your point, right? Like for the LCSW, I have to acquire 3,000 hours, right? And they have to be broken down into like certain amounts. But part of it is that, you know, having a discussion today with my own therapist about different diagnoses, where I'm like, you know, hey, remind me, like, is this a part of this specific disorder? And she's like, oh, definitely. And I'm like, I'm glad we're having this conversation, because this is like helping me personally and professionally. So like, thank you for doing that. But it is very much, kind of like that thrusting and like, to, you know, California's credit is like, well, I mean, I'm glad I'm not trying to private practice with a bachelor's degree, because that would be a nightmare. Yeah, it would just cause so much more damage. But, you know, everybody needs help from, you know, dealing with collective trauma. Let's just get anybody in here, you know, honestly. This was so good, Moriah. I love this. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about all of this and about your experience. I really appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that piece of yourself. If there was one like piece of recommended reading or a movie or a TV show or like media of any kind that you would recommend for people who are more interested in getting to understand the queer community, maybe they haven't they didn't know gay girls existed, right? Because they've been raised in a certain culture. Like what is something that has been meaningful and impactful for you in your journey?
How to pick just one thing.
And you know what? I'll take up to 5. I mean, let's not put a limit on it. That's fine. That's 100% fine.
I think in terms of something that's a little bit more like nonfiction reading, I love the book Beyond Shame by Matthias Roberts. He is a therapist and he identifies as Christian and gay. And he also has a podcast named Queerology that's super awesome. But he wrote this book Beyond Shame that's like thinking about your sexuality and your ethic, especially it's accessible to everyone. He does talk a little bit about his like religious background, but just thinking about like what your values are and what's important to you sexually, because there isn't a black and white sexual ethic. Like there isn't because purity culture is very much like do this, don't do this. So it can feel really unsettling to leave that and then just be like, now what? Like there's so much. Right. So that's a really helpful resource, especially for people who grew up in purity culture or evangelicalism. And it was just also really refreshing to read because he just like used examples of like queer couples and it was just like normal. Like,
normalizing. Yeah.
This is normal.
Yeah.
Like
I love
it's not
that.
all heterosexual couples. Like, and it's not a thing. Like he's just like,
yes,
this couple.
Yes.
So that's something that's a really helpful resource. And his podcast Queerology, he interviews people just on like their beliefs and identities, and it's super great. In terms of media, I really loved the show One Day at a Time. I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't. I actually have not seen that yet, so I'm going to put it on my list. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. I think it's actually like a reboot of a show or something, but it's a Cuban family in LA.
It's like the 3-generational. Yes. Yep.
So it's a Cuban family in LA, and a couple of episodes in or half into the first season, the daughter comes out as gay, and I just love her so much. I relate to her so much. But she's like very into social justice, like very, like connected with her identity, and they do a great job of like intersectionality. And there's just a ton of other great concepts in the film, like mental health, addiction, veteran, like all immigration. But I really love that because I would also guess that she's probably neurodivergent. It's not something they talk about, but like she's really having friends at school. Totally. She comes off a little bit like brashly because she like cares about all these things. But then she starts dating her partner named Sid, who's non-binary, and then they're just like so cute.
That show was doing the most work like 5 years ago.
It was so good.
That's amazing. That's incredible. I love that.
But it was really meaningful when I was thinking about coming out, because I obviously like had thought about it for like years before it actually happened. And Elena comes out and her mom like outwardly is like, I'm so supportive. And then she like goes to her lesbian friend and she's like, why do I not feel okay with this? Like I'm freaking out a little bit, but like I love my daughter, I support her. And she was like, when did Elena come out too? She's like, 36 hours ago. She's like, okay, she's probably been thinking about this for like months or years. And you're like thinking about changing your expectation, like, because she talks about like, we can't bond over boys or, like things like that.
Like stereotypical. Yeah.
So I think that like thinking about that was like, okay, like not everyone's reaction is going to be what it like will be forever. Like people will need some time to adjust. Totally. And then of course, like the Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode where Rosa comes out is like very much a bisexual coming out. So highly recommend that for especially people who are bisexual, it's just like, it's very normalizing of, because her parents do the reductive, like, well, you can marry a man, so that's fine.
Yeah. That,
So
that
like
is an episode I remember seeing and need to revisit for sure. And speaks toward to like the biphobia and bi-erasure that, you know, is so common. I feel like, especially like being millennials, I feel like that's a very common thing for our generation, is for it to be an erased identity or an invalidated identity, for sure.
Yeah. So I think those are the recommendations I have off the top of my head.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that we can do this again, because there were like 4 things that I could riff with you for another hour about. So this was awesome.
Yes.
Thank
I'd
you
love
so
to.
much.